it to you, Renee.
Right. Well, welcome. This is our first session in the learning series with the Michigan Science Educational Leadership Association. And we are joined today by Rochelle and Leanne from MDE, and they are going to be sharing with us a little bit more unpacking around the Michigan Merit Curriculum and how that applies to science. Now we can think a little bit more creatively and locally based on school specific needs. Wendy just went ahead and put the parking lot in the chat if you want to access that to load in some questions. We'll also be monitoring the chat as we go today. If you do have any questions, feel free to share those there, and then we'll capture the ideas and the resources and things in the parking lot as well. So I want to start off by thanking Rochelle and Leanne for joining us today, and I will let you take it from there.
Thanks for the welcome. Thanks for the opportunity. I know we're excited to be here. We're going to start with just a little warm up in the chat with an introduction to help us center ourselves in our work. So think about joy and wonder and engagement, and what either in school or out of school experiences do you have that really foster those responses for you? So in the chat, add your name, your role, and a response to the prompt. So we'll pause for a second for all of us to do that. I love seeing the responses in the chat. Some of them are even surprising me. I have more questions. My colleague Rochelle, who loves animals so much.
I do. I knew
found joy and wonder in animal dissection. I did not know this. I would expect to see you resuscitating a raccoon on the side of the.
If there's a chance of that, I will resuscitate the raccoon. But if it's already dead, I'm digging in. I'm digging in. That applies even now while I'm out walking with the dogs. So,
my goodness, wonderful. Awesome. Thanks everyone for sharing. So we're going to be using both the chat and individual think reflect time today. So just kind of watch for prompts. And if there's not a chat bubble there and you want to put it in the chat anyways, go ahead. We're going to hit 3 big outcomes today. We're hoping that you really understand the flexibility that comes along with the Michigan Merit Curriculum. As we specifically look at science examples, we want you to think about science pathways and kind of reimagining your local context, whatever role you have, how you can help local implementation around addressing challenges and looking for opportunities that are really student-centered. And I'm going to hand it over to Rochelle.
Thank you. So the first of our 3 objectives, and I wanted to stay on this slide just for a second. You'll notice that there's 3 links on this slide, and the first 2 are those sections of legislation. So section A, 1278A and B. A is the Michigan Merit Curriculum, B is the personal curriculum, and some of those other flexibilities. So if you want to read those actual sections of legislation, we give you a link there. And then also the high school page the michigan.gov/high school. I just refer to that as the high school page, but you can find everything related to the Michigan Merit Curriculum, the standards, testing out. There's just a lot of information and resources linked from that high school page. All right, so because this is a little bit new group or a different group than what I'm normally with, we thought, Leanne and I thought it was really important just to set that foundation for our time together today with the Michigan Merit Curriculum. So we know that there's across the state, there's a lot of different layers or levels of interest and understanding of the Michigan Merit Curriculum. But in order for us to have this conversation grounded in science, we need to first really set that stage for what the Michigan Merit Curriculum is and how that format will flow into science. So what you're seeing now in front of you on well, it's on my right side is a one pager. So I just refer to this as the MMC one pager. It's got the Career and College Ready banner on the top. And this is just a document that I use pretty frequently when I'm out and about in the field. And it's really just the cheat sheet, if you will, for the Michigan Merit Curriculum. So that's something, and you can get the link to that right below if that's something you want to share with colleagues or access electronically. But I just want to stay on this page just for a second to talk about a couple things that are really important to this Michigan Merit Curriculum and this package in legislation, if you will. So the first thing is that all of the requirements that we have, so I'm talking about those 18 credits, right? We have 18 credits that are required in the state of Michigan for any student who wants to get a diploma. So those 18 credits are all built around the idea that credits are, one, issued by school districts. So they're not issued by the state, they're issued by a school district. And the second big thing is that those credits should only be granted to students when they have demonstrated that proficiency. So that's a little bit of a shift maybe for where schools were at pre-MMC, where we would hear things like 2 years of math is required or biology is required and some of that other language. This legislation, the Michigan Merit Curriculum, was really built on the premise that credit should be granted to students when they have demonstrated that mastery of content. So all of the requirements, we're not just going to talk about science right now, but all of the requirements, those 18 credits, are all based on demonstrated proficiency, not based on seat time and not based on course completion. So just as one example, I'm going to just talk about English because it's at the top. So the requirement for English in the state of Michigan is 4 credits, not 4 years, but 4 credits. And underneath that is where it states that those 4 credits would be granted based on proficiency in those high school ELA content standards. So those credits could be earned in 4 days or 4 months or 6 years, depending on how that student progresses and how that district has built their course sequencing, but it's not based on time, and it's also not based on English 9, English 10, English 11, English 12. It's really up to the district how they take those high school English standards and spread those out across a sequence of courses or experiences. So the little question, Leanne, I'm not sure if your little bubble question, is that something that we are going to talk about or that you just
we can talk about it or put it in the chat.
Okay. Gotcha. So just again, just based on this broader idea of these 18 credits that are all based on proficiency, not seat time or courses, one thing to think about is whatever context you are sitting in, so whatever district or high school or ISD, whatever your setting is, classroom teacher, how are your district processes aligned or not aligned to the way I just described the graduation requirements? Because for some districts, pretty well aligned. Other districts, not so much. So just something for you to think about, how well aligned is your district or your space to those actual graduation requirements? All right. So with that, the whole idea or the whole premise behind those 18 credits is that when proficiency is demonstrated, credit is granted, but that there's also a lot of ways that that can happen, right? Students are not just learning while they're sitting in a course. Students are learning outside of school, inside of school, at those extracurricular activities. They're learning at home from their parents. They're learning at their job. Students are always learners. And the Michigan Merit Curriculum wants to recognize that whenever that occurs. So this slide is just showing some, not an unlimited list, but some of the ways that students could gain that mastery or demonstrate that learning to be able to earn that credit. So in the first space, you see traditional courses. This is what we're all used to, right? A lot of districts have a biology class and that earns a science credit. And then students the next year will take a physics class. But there are other ways that credits can be granted and students can earn those credits. So integrated courses, there might be one class that covers both science and math. And if that happens, a student can definitely earn both credits in that same class. The next one is CTE courses. It is pretty awesome what a lot of the CTE spaces across the state do. So they've really done an amazing job of embedding MMC standards in their career and tech ed programs or courses. So if a student takes a mechatronics course or program, and there's a huge chunk of the science content covered in that program, then the student can absolutely earn a science credit there. So instead of taking physics back at the high school, maybe the students are going to learn that same science content or those same standards in the mechatronics or in an after school robotics or anything like that. The credit would be seen as equivalent. The next bubble is outside of school. So there could be a student who is taking guitar lessons at the YMCA or who is traveling or who's taking part in sports. Well, if there is some crossover between those activities and MMC standards, then students could absolutely earn credit from those outside of school activities. Testing out, we're going to talk a little bit about later on, but testing out is the idea that we wouldn't want a student to take a course if they already know the content that's going to be delivered and instructed upon in that course. So testing out is a piece of legislation that says if a student can show us that they know the content, we don't want them taking the course. You have to give them the credit outside of the course name. They're earning that credit for the learning that they already have. All right, so this one is just, again, going back to the idea of traditional courses. This is that mapping, if you will, or a spreadsheet of what maybe a traditional course sequence would look like, probably in the districts that you're working in or the schools that you may have that are familiar with, right? So this is just outlining what it might look like in 6th grade through 12th grade for students, some of the classes that you might see listed or experiences that student would take. So these are just model pathways, different sequences. And we also did link for you in the slide. You can link to the science standards and you can link to some of those mapping resources that we have on our website. Leanne, do you want to add anything on this one? I know you built this one, so I don't want to make sure I'm not forgetting anything.
Sure. I just think that model course mapping document was heavily utilized when Michigan first adopted the 3-dimensional standards. And we put I think there was a lot of emphasis just put on sequence, and sequence is important as we think about our local context and learning. But the questions at the bottom, I think, are the ones we need to keep in mind, right? So we've built this sequence, this pathway for students. Are all 71 of the Michigan science standards accounted for in this sequence that you've built? And do your transcripts coordinate with that proficiency for those standards? So sometimes we make some assumptions around course titles and what that might include. And really the legislation is that the 3 science credits are connected to the 71 science standards. So this is just maybe like a little check, like, when is the last time we looked at that? And does that pathway actually match up when we think about our traditional course pathway in our local setting?
One thing I like about this chart is that, and I get this question a lot, is can students earn, science, high school science credit in middle school? And in this chart, it's showing that, I can't answer that question black and white, right? Because there's always more to the story. So the way I always have to bounce it back to schools is that, well, it really depends, right? It's not about that they took a class called biology or earth science or space science or whatever the class is called. It's about, did they learn some of those 71 standards, right? So if a student gained that proficiency on a subset of those 71 science standards in any grade, regardless of what age they're at, then they are able to earn those high school credits. So it really depends on the content and on that mastery more so than the name of the course. All right, so this one is just showing sorry, I have it open in two places, so my mind is wanting to connect the two. So here we're just showing that there's examples of integrated courses. So in my example on the slide previous is that you could have a course that does math and science, and that's one of the examples on this table. So we love the idea of double dipping, of courses being integrated, of courses that cover multiple content areas. And in my opinion, that's kind of how the standards were created. And the standards were meant to be cross aisle and cross integrated and put together like that. So this one is just showing a couple examples, couple possibilities. There are millions out there, I would argue, but just showing an example where a class or a experience could cover science and math and computer science in this one, right? So here's all the standards that would be covered regardless. This one has a fun, I'm never good at coming up with names of these courses, but Computers Save the Planet. I love that name. It's going to be coded as a science course, but it's covering math and it's covering science and it's covering computer science. So the district can absolutely have that course come up as these multiple areas on a transcript. So in that top example, the students are getting half of a credit of science, half of a credit of math, and then they're also getting a quarter of an elective credit, right? So that's always going to be up to the district, but on our end, we love ideas like this and courses like this, and that's a great way to put science and math together. The next one is showing science and social studies. So science, technology, future of warfare, right? It's coded as a science class, but it's also covering social studies, and students are able to earn those credits. So maybe that has you thinking, are there examples of that already happening in your spaces, in your schools, in your districts, in your ISD? If so, share those with Leanne and I at some point, because we'd love to highlight you for doing awesome integration examples. But you can probably also think of other ways. I'm hearing a lot of social studies in ELA right now. That's a big one where schools are wanting to have a social studies or an English course, but also cover the other, and students are earning social studies and ELA in one space. We love all of those examples, and double dipping in that way just makes sense. So then the same thing with CTE courses in terms of granting those multiple credits. So any CTE course or program, does this one have other? There we go. So any CTE course or program that also covers the science standards, or any standards, but in this example, science, they can award that credit for that space as well. So a student could potentially be earning their CTE credits, whatever that is. That looks different in every CTE program that I've been to across the state. It's always a different number of credits and different things, but they could also on top of that earn science credit if that student is learning science in that space. So along with that, there's also this idea of credit waivers. So, and there's a document that we can link to, oh, it is linked there. It's linked in the middle of the slide there in the blue. It's called Leveraging CTE. But what that table that just popped up in the bottom right is talking about is that the MMC legislation built in a lot of flexibility that allows students to take certain courses that are relevant to them to make sure that they're making their 4 years or however many years they're in high school make sense. So there's two different waivers in the Michigan Merit Curriculum legislation. One is for a science credit, which makes sense because that's what we're talking about today. And then the other one is world language. So just speaking about the science one, I just want to point out that there's really two options for students in Michigan regarding that MMC science requirement. The first option is that students learn all 71 standards and they earn the 3 credits, right? And that's the majority of students are doing that, or they're supposed to be doing that. But the other option is using this waiver in which a student is going to complete a CTE program. Any program, it doesn't matter as long as it's a state approved formal CTE program. And if they are going to be a completer, districts are allowed to waive one of the 3 science credits, meaning that a student is only going to earn 2 of the 3 credits, and they're only going to learn or master 2/3 of the science standards. And I don't know the math in that right off the hat, whatever 2/3 of 71 is. But so those are basically the 2 options and this waiver flexibility that was put into the MMC law. And again, that's really just to allow students that flexibility to say what makes the most sense for this one student. Does it make sense for them to go to CTE and forego one of these science courses? Or does it make sense for the student to make sure they earn all 3 science credits? And that should depend on what they want to do after high school. If they're going to a 4-year college, if they're going to a 2-year college, and all of that should come into play when making these decisions. So the question at the bottom there is just thinking about the district or the space that you work in. Are you utilizing these options? Are you utilizing either integration, or are you utilizing this waiver, or both? And if not, maybe that's something that you might want to talk about in your local context, is how we could utilize these waivers, or how we could talk about maybe doing some more integration. And if that's something that we can help with in any way, just let us know. So outside of school activities, and this one usually blows people's minds a little bit when I say, well, you can give credit for that, out of school robotics that they're a part of, or if that student works on a family farm, maybe they're learning some science in that space. And if they can come back and demonstrate it, they can absolutely earn that credit. So credit is not just something that can be granted for things they do inside the 4 walls or the virtual setting of the school. They can absolutely use any other time or activity in that learning space, and then come back to school and demonstrate that proficiency and earn that credit. And it can be for science or otherwise. I had a good example of this for an art credit. So a lot of students were in a church choir outside of school, had nothing to do with school. They did it on the weekends on their own time. And that school granted those students their art credit because they were able to come back. They put together a portfolio showing the art standards that they gained proficiency on, and that school they granted them an art credit for that out of school, out of time. And I thought that was a great use of this flexibility to look at things they're doing outside of school. So for science, though, it would have to be, did they learn a subset of those 71 standards outside of school? And are they able to come back and kind of demonstrate that learning? That would be the question that I would put back on the school if they ask me if they could grant credit for something. All right, so testing out, and this is linked again. There's a testing out FAQ that my name is also attached to, but I just want to mention testing out. And if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat or reach out after the fact. But testing out is a pretty vague, general line. It's only a line or so in the legislation, but it basically says any student, any requirement, anytime, sorry. My helpers, if you will. So testing out is any student, any MMC requirement, at any time, but I have to put the little caveat that the any time is also a little bit up to the district, right? So districts get to decide when their testing out window might be and how students have to apply to be able to test out. All of those things come into district control or district processes or procedures. But really, we hope that districts will err on the side of being flexible and being open and seeing testing out as a positive thing, because it really is meant to be, right? It's meant to be, hey, if you can show us that this material or these content standards, then we want to be able to grant you the credit. And that should allow you to maybe move on to the next more difficult class, or maybe it'll lead to more dual enrollment or taking, other electives, whatever that means. But testing out is just that clause that says, if you can show us what you know, we can grant you credit and you won't have to physically take that class. And this is just included a couple of the FAQ questions that are in that larger FAQ, testing out FAQ. So locally, the question on the slide is, what is your local process for testing out? Does it meet some of these criteria, or is it a little more rigid and maybe outside of some of the intention of this legislation? I've seen some really good testing out policies and procedures, and I've seen some not so great ones. So just to reflect on that a little bit, where your local district might be at with testing out.
So Rochelle, I think what we're going to do is, I think we're still going to play this game next, our little formative assessment check, to see how everyone's coming along. And while we do that, do you mind starting to scan some of the questions in the parking lot? There's some great ones there that I think you'll be ready to respond to quickly, and some that might move down to the bottom for our deeper dig for section, the next session 2.
Sounds
so
good. Yep.
We're going to do a little, I know we're a small group, no pressure to this small group. We're going to play a little game. So you're going to just put yes or no in the chat, wait to hit enter. We're going to do a waterfall, and we're just going to check in on your understanding. For each question, is the described practice or scenario supported by the Michigan Merit Curriculum, the MMC legislation? So it's just a yes or a no answer. And if you're feeling end of day-ish on a Monday, you can just do Y or N. It's all right. Rochelle, I think you're still in charge, so I'll have to have you click just one at a time. Don't reveal. All right, first prompt. After completing 1 semester of high school biology, a student should be issued a half science credit. Okay. Oh,
sorry. I'm cheating.
Yet. I was just gonna say 1, 2, 3, enter. You can change your answer if you saw it. Go ahead, Rochelle. And one more click. So let's keep in mind credits not based on seat time. So there's nothing in that statement around whether the student had shown proficiency, how many credits. I'm sorry, how many standards were shown proficiency? So that is a no. Okay. Rochelle, I'll tell you when to click.
Yep, perfect.
Next question. A high school freshman is enrolled in a course called physics and is allowed to test out of quote unquote physics during the 2nd week of school. Is this supported by the Michigan Merit Curriculum? I'm going to give you 10 seconds to think, and then we'll do our countdown. All right, go ahead and hit enter. And then Rochelle, yes, if your local guidelines allow a student to test out of a course currently enrolled in, that is fine. If there's not a window being offered during that time because the school year started, that's also up to the local to determine their test out process. So this could be a local difference, right? In one district, you could test out of a class that you're in, and another that may not be an opportunity. Next question, determining proficiency in the state content standards is a local decision. A few seconds to think. Get your why or no in the chat. Go ahead and hit enter. And Rochelle, the answer is yes. So, and this is really where things get in the weeds, right? What does it mean to be proficient? Is really a local decision. And we see really big differences between locals on how they determine proficiency in those standards. All right, we've got 3 more questions. Next slide. A high school student is told by a teacher that 3 years of science is required to graduate. Yes or no? All right, go ahead and hit enter. No, remember, credit's not based on seat time, so it's based on the proficiency of those standards. I think we get into this language when we create a traditional course sequence with traditional amount of credits, and we start to translate it to seat time. So we want to make sure we stay out of that area. Next question, a high school student's transcript reports 0.25 biology credit and 0.5 geography credit for a 1-semester course titled Whose Earth Is It Anyways? Three more seconds. Go ahead and hit enter. All right, great. So yes, we can report multiple credits across different content areas. The key here is that your transcript does not have to necessarily reflect course names. And so you can have creativity in how you build your courses, and also make sure your transcripts reflect local priorities around what your student needs are and your community needs are. Last question, a student submits a portfolio demonstrating proficiency of the 8 science standards missed in a previously failed course and is issued a credit. Is that supported by the MMC? All right, 3 more seconds. Answers coming in. Go ahead and hit enter. Rochelle, you want to hit enter? Great. So remember, in all those examples, when proficiency is proven, credit can be issued. The district's going to determine the process for how that works, whether it's a portfolio, a test out practice, a teacher mentor process. That is a local decision of when they decide proficiency has been shown in those standards and when credit would be issued. So the next slide, go ahead, Rochelle, summarizes some of those pieces that we looked at. And probably keeping that up, Rochelle, do you want to address a few of the questions from the parking lot?
Yeah, yep. So I don't know if I'm gonna, let me just leave it. I'll just leave it there a second. So yes, there's some great questions in the parking lot. I'm gonna start from the bottom. There's no such thing as priority standards. Stop it with that. I don't want to hear that. Every time I hear power standards, it makes my skin crawl. That work has already been done. The 71 standards are the priority standards. It's not anyone else's job to cut them down further. There are 71 standards. That's it. 71. There's no priorities. Those are the priority standards. Have I made myself clear? Sorry, it's afternoon. I get spicy as the day goes on. So there are no priority standards. All right. Above that, how will a district code a class with multiple subject credits being issued regarding teacher certification? So we have to remember that that's a whole different law regarding teacher certification, and that has nothing to do with credit. So that could be a whole presentation just on its own, but we have to remember that the teacher certification has to match what you're calling the class. So if I'm going to call a class biology, then yes, the teacher has to have the right certification and endorsement to teach biology. But that doesn't mean that the students can't earn a math credit or that the students can't earn an English credit. Those are two very different laws. So if anyone is kind of struggling with that and has questions, you can certainly reach out. But there's the teacher certification law that says the name of the course has to match the teacher certification. And then there's the credit law that says credit has nothing to do with certification. Credit only has to do with what a student can demonstrate that they have mastery in. How should districts address the creative courses to help communicate to colleges what students have completed when it comes to course names? That's really up to districts. Like Leanne said a minute ago, you don't have to list course names on a transcript. You could list math, science, English. That's really up to you as a district, but I understand the question being, we don't want to do creative things that then take away a student's opportunity to go to a certain college, right? We would never want to do that. So as long as we're focusing on proficiency and making students have that learning and understanding, I think I would love to see a shift more to a standards-based transcript or standards-based reporting. A lot of districts aren't ready for that kind of shift yet, but other states have gone that direction. And even inside Michigan, there are some districts who don't necessarily list courses, but they list the standards in some way. Leanne, do you see any that you want to tackle? How do we ensure transcripts are showing proficiency? That's up to you as a district, right? Right now, I would argue that we're really not. We just put a course name and a grade, and that doesn't tell us proficiency at all. So that's going to be up to a district in terms of if they want to take it one step farther, if they want to aggregate their standards in some way, that's really up to them.
I was just looking at this
go ahead.
outside. It's right below where they're typing right now. When
Okay.
schools plan for out of school and assigning credit, should proficiency look the same in the classroom? So this is connected to what Rochelle was just talking about. So proficiency should be standardized, right?
Mhm.
That's determined locally. So whatever the bar of proficiency is, that is the bar. And then what process the district wants to use to determine that can be locally determined. So, I mean, anything from, all right, we're going to offer all the kids that did robotics the test out for Algebra 1,
Like
right?
the final exam, like the
a final
cumulative
exam.
final exam.
We're going to, in this integrated class, for those social studies standards, we're going to do some cross-department work, and we're going to vet some of that proficiency through another teacher. We're going to have a business mentor program that does a lot of that legwork. And then we're going to have a point of contact in the school that's a content expert, portfolios. I think the challenge is that our student information systems, whatever system you're using for creating student schedules, interfacing with your teacher gradebook, generating report cards, and ultimately generating transcripts. We've set those up to reduce the burden on humans, the adult humans, right? So that it will automatically generate a lot of these pieces. And that's sort of that question around course name. Typically it's just been set up so that the course name is what appears with the credit that's earned. And that takes work to really think about how we might reimagine that process so that we center the student needs and that students who have proficiency are able to earn it. I would even say the amount of credit, the examples we were using were quarters and halves, but the amount of credit earned is even a local decision associated with those standards.
when thinking about, are they equal, right? I get asked that question a lot. Like, do I have to give them the final exam as the test out? No, you don't have to. That's always up to you locally. But I do urge that it should be equitable, not the same test, but it shouldn't be easier or harder than what the students in the class had to do to show proficiency. So it should be, it should be on the same rigor level. How can you assess students on standards outside of their grade band? Assessing high school and middle school. A district would have to decide how to do that. But if you have a student who's in 7th grade or 8th grade and wants to test out of a high school credit, because that's really what they're doing, is they're testing out of a credit, not a course, right? But I would recommend, if I got that call, I would recommend that they use the same assessments or very similar assessments that they're using in that high school space, because that's what we're measuring. We're measuring the same level of proficiency as we would in high school.
I think maybe we're down to the first 3 bullets. I don't know, Wendy, Renee, if that sounds accurate.
So yeah, so I'm going to go to the first one. So it was stated that the 71 are the standards. So there are 71 science standards. So basically, I think the question is around, why are there course names in the legislation? Because there still are, right? And we've actually answered that. There's some FAQ questions that tackle that. But when the legislation mentions course names, they do mention biochem, physics, but then they also mention 8 different other names for courses. They're not mentioning those. They're not stating those as requirement. They're stating those as potential courses that could be a vehicle to the actual requirement, which is the standards. So biology is not a requirement in the state of Michigan. We don't care if they ever sit in a class called biology, but we do require that they have proficiency over all 71 standards, regardless of where they learn those. We understand that it's messy and it becomes gray because the legislation leaves those in. We keep asking them to take out those course names, but they're not mentioning those as required. If you read the line before it and after it, it very clearly says students need to learn the standards, all of the standards. They could do it this way, biochem, physics, blah, or they could do it any other way as long as they learn the standards.
And I would add, I just had a question recently too, that it's really important to look at the FAQ because that is the guidance, right? Doing a local interpretation of the legislation and ignoring the guidance from Michigan Department of Ed will result in probably a different interpretation, but the department's task is to provide that guidance to ensure that students are and districts can meet the needs of the students and of the Michigan Merit Curriculum. So I think that's important to not look at the legislation in isolation from the guidance.
Yep. I think I vote that we go back to the PowerPoint and then come back to these if we have time at the end, just because I don't want to cut us short. All right, so Leanne's going to take it from here, and I just want to point out that the link on this slide is going to take you to the K-12, not just high school, but all of our standards on the high school page are K-12. So if you want to know what any of the standards are, including science, they're all linked from that high school page, and this link is to the science one specifically.
So when we talk about this, proficiency is proven, credit is issued, and I love what Wendy put in the chat earlier around needing it's really mucky. We need waiters when we talk about proficiency.
Very true.
One of the challenges with science is really, we've had some major shifts when we updated our standards in 2015. And I know the experts on the call know this. I think it's still powerful for us to just process it again as we think about this context. So We know our standards are from the framework, and it's a shift from learning about science to really doing science. And we've got these multidimensional standards, and we have standards in not just our life and physical science, but we also have earth and space science. Those are part of the 71. We're not forgetting those, and our engineering standards. So when we think about proficiency and the three-dimensionality of the standards, we know that this presents a lot of opportunities for rich learning, and it also presents a lot of challenges as we try to understand what that means locally to say a student is proficient.
All
So
right.
when we
Go
yeah,
ahead.
go ahead. No, I think this was you. Go ahead, Rochelle.
So this is just reiterating, and again, this calls out just what I was tackling in that question that was in the parking lot, right? And question 5 in the little bubble is saying that. Why do districts have to provide the courses specified in the legislation? And very clearly we said no. We understand that the legislation may use some wording that list courses, but it isn't doing it as a requirement. It's more like listing of potential course sequencing, but it's more important that we talk about the content. And sometimes in order to get people to change, to think about things differently, I have to say that even a class called biology might not be worth a science credit. Right? We have no idea. I have no idea if your biology class is worth a science credit, because in order for it to be a science credit, it can't just be that because you've called it biology. That's irrelevant to me. You as a district have to say, well, in this space called biology, we are making sure that students are learning and understanding these 25 content standards, and here's the proof that they've done it. Right? If you're coloring and watching Disney movies all semester in biology, it's not going to be worth a science credit. So we have to remove that idea that name tells us much about proficiency and standards alignment, right? There has to be another step or another layer of work beyond that at the district level to decide what credit or credits a course may produce. So the math of this webinar is 71 equals 3, right? I say that a lot in my other presentation. The math is 71 equals 3. And that's how this requirement is, it's how it's supposed to work, right? A student learns all of that and they earn those 3 credits. Another link to the FAQ is on there. And I also want to look at the box that has the number 2 in front of it, because I think for a long time, a lot of people viewed that 3rd science credit, right, as this science elective, I would hear that term, or this other in science. But hopefully you've caught on to the fact that that's not true at all. There is no difference between a 1st science or a 2nd science or a 3rd science. There are just 3 science credits, and they represent those 71 standards. So as soon as I hear a district say, they have to take biology and chemistry and then any science elective, I'm going, none of their students are meeting the MMC, right? I just have faith that that's not happening because of how they worded that. So it has to be more intentional than that. So this is just reiterating that this is more of that traditional approach where during a student's freshman year, we'll start with middle school. So in a student's middle school experience, they're probably doing some of that foundational learning. Credits are not really granted in middle school. There are no requirements in middle school. There are no requirements in Michigan K-8, but everything that happens K-8 is that prereq or that pre-learning or that foundational learning to what is coming when they get to high school, when credits do start to really matter and where that proficiency really matters. And then we have all the other years, freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and a student would work through. And it's not to say that this isn't a way that it could be done with some sort of efficacy. It could be, but it has to be a little more intentional, where a school is saying, okay, a student's typical freshman year, they may take this class, and if they do this class and pass this assessment, that's going to earn them a science credit because they've just demonstrated mastery of a third of the science requirement. Do you want to add anything on this one, Leanne?
I think maybe it's just important to reflect on the benefits and challenges of this pathway and who benefits and who faces challenges as students. When we build the traditional pathway, there's often winners and losers for students. And so it's important to really examine what we've built. And going back to earlier in the slide deck, does our traditional pathway even represent those 71 science standards?
Mm-hmm.
That would be a good beginning step if that's not where you're at in a local, or you have locals that aren't there. That would be step one, getting your traditional pathway in order to make sure that those 71 standards are reflected in that pathway. And then from there, thinking about what students are really not benefiting from this pathway and how can we meet their needs, which I think the next slide helps us kind of think about.
And this leaks into conversations and choices about curricula, about resources, because I can almost guarantee that if most districts would hand me their 3 books, right, their biology, their chemistry, and their physics books, I can guarantee that there's a chunk of those 71 standards that isn't in that sequence. And it may be a lot more than you realize. So buying the curriculum or buying the textbook is a step, but it has to be more thorough than that, than just those textbooks that are out there. So just showing that pathway again, that there's those 71 high school standards. There's a lot of different ways that a student could demonstrate proficiency for that learning to happen. But the outcome, hopefully, is that those 3 science credits would be issued to that student based on their proficiency. And not that state summative testing is the end all be all. I don't care about it any more than anyone else in our system. But I do care that we send a lot of students to those assessments ill-equipped, because we haven't made sure that that learning has occurred, and that's what's going to be assessed. Those 71 standards is, without a doubt, what's going to be put in front of those students during that 11th grade assessment. We're not guessing. We know that those 71 standards is what's going to be assessed. We know that those high school ELA standards is what's going to be assessed. So we know what's on the assessment, just making sure that we carve that out and be intentional about that learning would help every district with looking at that proficiency. All right, so going into section 3, Leanne.
So we did want to build in some time for conversation and thinking about the local challenges and the opportunities as you think about engaging students and them demonstrating proficiency. So I think it would be helpful just to do some think time. I know we have a few people still on the call, and there's also some things in the Q&A. So as you think about these local challenges, we also want to think about what we can do about them. So let's take a minute I'm going to turn my camera off. Rochelle, everybody turn their camera off. What are the local challenges when you think about implementing the MMC? What are the opportunities? And we're going to do some sharing here in a minute.
Turned off my self view. Now I can't find it.
Another 30 seconds to finish your brainstorming of challenges and opportunities. And in the chat, I'm dropping a Jamboard link because that still works until the end of this year. And our first slide in the Jamboard are challenges. And you'll notice, Rochelle, do you mind clicking to the next graphic? Thanks. You'll notice that we see 3 spheres. So I think in this work, depending on where you're at in your role, it can be frustrating because there's certain things that you may feel like, if I could just do this one thing, it would fix a lot for this local district, right? So we know that there are things that are just out of our sphere of influence, and that's okay. Sometimes we just have to recognize it. So on the Jamboard, take a look at your challenges first. So that's the first slide, and plot out where your challenges fall. Are they within your sphere of control? You have direct control of them. Are they in your sphere of influence? You know the individuals who make the decisions, who set up the student information system, that create the policies, or is it something that is outside of both of those, something that you don't have control over? So take a few minutes on the Jamboard. Challenges on the first slide, and then on the second slide are the opportunities, and we're just going to add our challenges and opportunities. You haven't shifted to the second Jamboard slide to start capturing some opportunities. I'm going to nudge you to do so now.
I think I've answered all the questions in the parking lot too, so. That way,
Thanks,
if people
Michelle.
if people access it afterwards, I think I've gone in and tackled them.
Right. So as you continue to add those, feel free to make sure you're looking at what others are identifying. Sometimes that feels good to know others are in the same boat. And there might also be some ideas and the opportunities that you could leverage, some things that maybe you hadn't considered that maybe are in your sphere of control. And just remember, because something is outside of someone's sphere of control or sphere of influence does not mean that it's not inside yours, right? Your position really will influence whether that sticky note stays in that sphere of control, influence, or kind of lands in everything else. So as we think about the flexibility and these opportunities that are afforded to us, the other thing we can consider is what else might be accomplished through the Michigan Merit Curriculum Flexibility. So on the next slide, Rochelle's going to put up some questions. And the fourth slide on the Jamboard, there was a blank one on purpose. I'm going to encourage you to use the colored sticky notes that you see and see if you can answer each question. So how might the Michigan Merit Curriculum engage more students in science and engineering? So when we think about the flexibility opportunities that are available, how might that increase engagement or reduce the number of students repeating a course? How might it help address staffing challenges? Increase family engagement? Or maybe you had some other aha moment as Rochelle gave us a lot of ways that students have opportunities to earn credit. And remember, that's based on proficiency. So we're not handing out credits like candy tomorrow night, right? We're not just handing them out. We want students to earn proficiency. I think we create a lot of barriers to students having opportunities to demonstrate their proficiency and earn credit. You know, repeating an entire class when possibly there's been a lot of proficiency demonstrated on certain standards already in that course, in that local setting with the standards that are aligned to it. So let's take a few minutes on the Jamboard. See if you can answer 3, 4, 5 questions around the opportunities we find with Michigan Merit Curriculum Flexibility.
I'm not sure how to do that, Leanne. Someone was asking for a link to the Jamboard versus a QR code, but I'm not sure how to do that. Oh, she did it. Thank you.
Yep.
You're awesome.
We're seeing some great stuff come in on the Jamboard with connections. Feel free to keep adding to them as you think about those questions and the flexibility of the Michigan Merit Curriculum. You know, I think as we look at the flexibility, there's a lot of opportunity, but it also creates a lot of pathways. And for many of us, that starts to feel messy. So if we're really centering the students, it is going to be messy work, right? We're going to be making decisions that's best for them and not best necessarily just for the adults. So those are complicated questions that we have to navigate in the local setting to find that process to support the students when they have proficiency to demonstrate, and how we're going to give them that opportunity to do that. Rochelle, you said you answered most of the questions.
I do believe so.
Think maybe anybody on the call have any burning questions they still want to just put into the universe before we do our last few steps to wrap up?
Or any follow-up to the answers I put in there, or any continuing questions, that would be fine too.
So if you're looking on the parking lot, I did put them in italics below the yellow question. So those were the ones that Rochelle's referring to that she went back and answered. So just to wrap my head around it, if I have a course that I'm teaching and we've outlined these standards are going to be taught in this course, that they could then earn half a credit or whatever the credit is assigned proportionally based on the standards. If I don't get to one of my units, what's kind of the recommendation? Would they then need to get to those standards at a later time in order to fully get that credit, or how have schools kind of handled that piece of it?
I guess if we're going officially, right, by what the law says, yes, they'd have to get to them at some point. But so I think my best thought about this is I went to in New Hampshire once, and essentially they use more of a complete standards competency-based way of reporting. And so any student could go into their data, and if it was red, they hadn't gotten there, they didn't know those standards. If it was yellow, those were standards they were working on this week or whatever. And if they were green, those were things that were complete, right? So that was the best way for me to kind of grasp that there's a way to do this that isn't just they have a C in the class right now, right? Because they've turned in this homework and they may have failed the final exam, but it's okay because they did extra credit, right? Which really has nothing to do with what the student has learned or mastered, right? So officially the answer to your question would be yes, those would be in the red. Those are things they haven't learned. But it does get messy because, right, and then the next teacher's like, so I got to cover what the last teacher didn't do, and it just gets messy, which is why it has to be very intentional and cumulative, and everyone in the building has to be on board with the idea of standards-based and proficiency, right? It isn't just about the worksheets or the time. It is about the expectation on the adults in this space is that we need to have students that are leaving proficient. And that's not necessarily how we set up our system many moons ago. So it's kind of hard to redirect that.
Feels like where the conversation almost has to start.
Yeah.
What does proficiency mean to us, and how are we going to define it, and how do we know when we've seen it?
Yeah.
How do we want to keep track of it?
because, when usually people jump to the idea that it's, a final exam, 100-point multiple choice final exam. Could it be that? Sure. But it could also be a paper and a project, a portfolio in a presentation, a midterm and a final, 10 quizzes, right? Like we don't get to vote on what the assessment or assessments are. They could look very different from one space to the other, but proficiency means they know it, right? If I had to define proficiency, I'm going to say like they know it. And districts get to decide so much beyond that. But most people are honest in saying our grades right now have nothing to do with proficiency. Our grades right now are how well did you play school, and did you come, and did you bring a pencil, and did you maybe try, or right? It doesn't really have anything to do with the learning. And so I think a lot of districts need to peel back some layers and get back to how they define proficiency, like Leanne just said, and figuring out the tools they're going to use to measure that.
Thank you for responding to that. I think too, like we were saying earlier, that's where it gets so mucky in the weeds, especially for science. Not that I'm not saying science is totally different than everything else, but with each standard are the 3 dimensions. So when we talk about, knowing it, it speaks a lot to the content and specifically focusing on that. So even in terms of thinking around standards-based grading, have you seen some really great systems that have tackled that specifically within science and those 3 dimensions per performance expectation?
I don't know. I'm not sure that I've seen a great example of, I've been to a lot of project-based schools and schools that say they're doing 3P, things like that, where I think that's what I was getting at with it doesn't have to be just the 100-question final exam multiple choice, because that may not hit. So especially in science, you're exactly right. It may not hit some of those expectations. Do you have, Leanne, you may have seen more in like examples of
there's not a lot of examples out there. The project that we're working on through the Access project, the NSF grant, is really the only examples we have so far. So we're hoping to have that ready for more distribution here this year. And I think that there's anything from just like having a conversation about proficiency, you could almost also have a conversation about what do we mean when we say we're going to do standards-based grading? And that really requires thinking about what you want to communicate to the student and the families and everybody else that's a consumer of grades. And there's a lot of consumers of grades. So that again is a local decision around what we want to communicate about student learning in science. And that's a really important question that goes closely with proficiency. So to have one without the other, I think we do that often. We have one without the other, and we got to have it together. So I'll be sharing more soon, Lene, around that project. Anybody else? Well, on the next slide, we just have sort of a summary of what we attempted to tackle today. And we're hoping to kind of get 2 things from you. I don't have a slide for the second thing. So the first one is think about a next step, big or small, that you plan to take to support the Michigan Merit Curriculum flexibility to meet the science requirements. So just kind of write that down for yourself. If you want to be brave and also put it in the chat, sometimes that accountability helps, right? So something big or small, what's your next step? And then on the parking lot document, at the very bottom, past the resources, it says session 2 deeper dive. So we really wanted the next session to meet the needs of you. So based on your learning, maybe based on what happens in that next step that you try out, We want to dive deeper into some specific topics to support you. Maybe that's even a problem of practice that you want to share with us around, this is my scenario. Let's think through this. Is this really, does this really meet the Michigan merit curriculum? This is what my district's telling me. So we're looking for problems of practice and where you want to do a deeper dive. I'd be remiss to not mention that Rochelle is also our expert on personal curriculum, which doesn't necessarily, she can speak to that for science. So we could talk about that. We can dig deeper into some of the maybe processes that locals have for addressing these needs, for talking about proficiency. So we are looking to you. So that doesn't have to be right now in this session. Our next session's not until February. So maybe we'll send a reminder closer to that date. Also, did you do your next step, big or small? And what problem of practice or deeper learning would you like us to take you through? So, Rochelle, anything else?
I don't think so. I just appreciate, you know, whether you joined us today or watched the recording, and in any way that Leanne or I or any of our colleagues can, you know, if you're interested in trying out some integration or working through the teacher certification piece or anything that we've mentioned, we're always looking for schools that are trying things, and we know it's not going to be perfect and it's not going to be, you know, it doesn't have to be, right? It's not about being perfect. It's just about trying things that are maybe different outside the box, but in the best interest of students. So any way we can help with that, just let us know. Rarely can I ever, in 12 years, I've hardly ever got to say like, no, you can't try that or you can't do that. Like there's so much flexibility in the laws that we have that are just not being taken advantage of.
And the last slide just has our contact info, so you don't have to wait until February to reach out. Feel free to reach out to us if you have something else you need support.
Okay, well, thank you both so much on behalf of MSELA for joining us this evening and giving of your time to share this out. I know this is a huge piece of our tasks as science leaders within districts, within ISDs, in our buildings. So we really do appreciate the clarification that you were able to provide, and hopefully that schools can think a little bit more creatively, especially as they move science forward now that we're kind of out of our new standards, that we have our feet wet and can think a little bit more deeply around what learning can and should be for our students. So thank you so much for being a part of this tonight. And I know as people continue to watch, I'm sure you'll see more on the parking lot that we can revisit at our next session. If you did not register for that, that is February 5th. Same place, wherever you are, 3:30 to 5 o'clock, and we will send that out as a follow-up as well. Thank you.
That's great. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye.